We have breaking news reporting tonight about just how close Donald Trump came to forcing the president of Ukraine to say investigations Biden and Clinton, the words that President Trump wanted him to say. After Gordon Sondland told the president of Ukraine that Ukraine would get no more military aid from the United States without a public statement by President Zelensky about Ukraine investigating Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, President Zelensky's staff began debating whether they should comply with Donald Trump's demand, and if so, exactly what President Zelensky should say. The future of their country was at stake. Everything was at stake. And so they went so far as to schedule an interview on CNN with Fareed Zakaria in which President Zelensky might have said what Donald Trump wanted him to say, or something close to what Donald Trump wanted him to say. But as that interview approached, where President Zelensky might have said the magic words into a microphone, as Donald Trump wanted, Politico published an article based on a leak that military assistance for Ukraine was being held up. And then the Washington Post published a similar story. And as the New York Times reports tonight, word of the freeze in military aid had leaked out, and Congress was in an uproar. 2 days before the scheduled interview, the Trump administration released the assistance, and Mr. Zelensky's office quickly canceled the interview. Not only had the news leaked out that Donald Trump was holding up assistance to Ukraine, but what the Trump administration already knew was that a whistleblower complaint had been filed against the president that was a very accurate description of President Trump's extortionist telephone call with President Zelensky. Joining our discussion now is Joyce Vance, a former U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Alabama and an MSNBC legal analyst, and Ambassador Wendy Sherman, former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in the Obama administration and an MSNBC Global Affairs contributor. And Ambassador Sherman, as you read this account, this kind of day-by-day account of what was going on in Ukraine, aides to the president of Ukraine thinking maybe we do have to say this in order to save the country. Were it not for the whistleblower and were it not for Politico, which to say, were it not for a free press and a whistleblower, who knows what might have happened?
Indeed, Lawrence, this is incredibly tragic. You know, we heard from George Kent today in that transcript that he's a Foreign Service officer who believes his job is to really insist on the rule of law. And it appears that Masha Yovanovitch, the ambassador, lost her job because she pushed for the end of corruption and the rule of law in Ukraine. And that wasn't liked because it got Rudy Giuliani and President Trump's way to get done what they wanted to get done in the deal they wanted to make with Zelensky. And so it's just rather heartbreaking to hear that a young new leader of a country who's trying to do the right thing and bring that rule of law to his country to really escape from the shadow of Russia is indeed almost to the point, because over 14,000 people have died since 2014. 24,000 people have been injured. He doesn't want more people to die. The javelins would really create fear among the Russians. They could deal with the tanks that are in the Donbass. Here we have this young president trying to do the right thing, our Foreign Service officers trying to do the right thing, and yet he had to think about seriously making this deal, in many ways, with the devil.
Joyce Vance, what's your reaction when you hear Republicans say, look, in the end, Ukraine got the aid, so what's the problem?
You know, one of the problems with this administration, Lawrence, is that so much happens every day that it's hard to keep track of it. But I can remember back in the early days of the Mueller investigation where Republicans said, well, you know, it's one thing if it's just colluding. If there was an actual crime, then we can talk. But as long as there's not an actual crime, there's nothing serious here. And what we have with Trump's conduct in Ukraine is an actual crime. The bribery statute makes it illegal for an elected official, for a public official, to seek something that's of personal value to them in exchange for being influenced in an official action. So we wade through all of the detritus that sort of surrounds these Ukrainian events, but at bottom, what we have is a crime. There's no other way of looking at this. And that makes the response, the lines of attack that we see from the Republicans all the more perplexing.
And Wendy Sherman, what's your reaction to what we're reading about the Ukraine side of all this? Here they have American officials, Gordon Sondland, these people trying to give them exact wording of what they want the president of Ukraine to say. And there's a lot of resistance. They are resisting. They recognize in Ukraine what's wrong with this. And they delay and delay and delay as much as they can. And they schedule that Fareed Zakaria interview for a couple of weeks down the road. And they're just constantly trying not to do this thing that Donald Trump is trying to force them to do.
Indeed, that's sort of the good news, Lawrence. President Zelensky and the people around him knew this was wrong. They didn't want to get in the middle of American domestic politics. They didn't want to do this deal with Donald Trump, brought to them by Rudy Giuliani and by Gordon Sondland. They knew that it was wrong, and yet the safety, security of their country, there was a report in the George Kent testimony that indeed the president changed his view of Ukraine after phone calls with Vladimir Putin and with Viktor Orban of Hungary, both people who do not have Ukraine's future in their minds unless that future becomes part of their orbit. And so it's really distressing what the president tried to do here. And the only good news in all of this is that President Zelensky and the people around him resisted as long as they could, understood what was going down here, and wished they didn't find themselves in this place.
Joyce Vance, I want to get your reaction to what we might expect in the public hearings next week, because we have seen such a spectacle that the Republicans make of public hearings in the House of Representatives that it's hard to predict. It's a level of chaos that even experienced people in Washington can't quite predict. You come from the world of courtrooms where there are so many more constraints on behavior. There's so much more order. It's impossible to get out of hand the way these Republicans do in these hearings. Have you, as you've watched these hearings, thought of any way procedurally, given that they have the right to speak, but any way for the Democrats to try to maintain control over the proceedings and make sure that what's happening is actually relevant to the investigation?
Not only have I watched these hearings, Lawrence, I've lived a little bit of it. This summer, I testified on the Hill on the House side on the Mueller report and experienced firsthand what it's like to be in the middle of this back and forth 5 minutes per side bantering. And I was struck by how serious the questions were about substance from the Democratic side and how flippant and sort of spurious the Republican comments were. And, that's what you do when you have no argument of substance that you can make. The Republicans are still in that position now when it comes to Ukraine. What will be different next week is this process change that the Democrats have written into the rules, where these hearings will open with 45 minutes of questioning on each side by staff attorneys. That, I think, is a total game changer. It gives each side, and particularly the Democrats here, who are sort of the proponents of this activity, the opportunity to give the American public a cohesive narrative. It's hard to sit down and read through all of these transcripts for people with busy lives and day jobs, but they'll be able to watch, I think, in pretty short, pretty precise snippets, the key moments here, and the key information gets conveyed in a much more meaningful way. The 5 minute back and forth is still going to happen. It's the nature of the beast.
Joyce Vance, Ambassador Wendy Sherman, thank you both for joining us tonight. Appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.